Margaret stood by the window watching carriages arrive one after another. Her youngest sister was getting married today, and the whole town of Willowbrook had turned out to celebrate. She smoothed down her plain blue dress, the same one she'd worn to her other sister's weddings. At 32 years old, she'd stopped buying new clothes for occasions like these. What was the point? The music drifted up from downstairs where guests were already dancing and laughing. Margaret could hear her mother's voice rising above the noise, telling anyone who would listen about how beautiful the bride looked. She didn't mention Margaret at all. She hadn't in years. 3 sisters, all younger than her, all married now. And here she was, still living in her father's house, still the subject of whispered conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room. She'd heard every name they called her: spinster, old maid, the unfortunate one, that poor Hayes girl who couldn't catch a husband. The worst part was that it hadn't always been this way. When she was 23, she'd had 2 proposals, real ones, from decent men. But she'd said no to both. The first man drank too much and had a cruel streak she'd noticed right away. The second was kind enough, but he'd made it clear he expected her to give up her books and her thoughts and become nothing more than a decoration in his home. Her father never forgave her for those refusals. He'd pulled her aside after the second one and told her she was being foolish, told her women like her couldn't afford to be picky. She remembered the way he'd looked at her, like she was a failed business investment that kept losing value. And maybe he was right, because here she was 9 years later and no one asked anymore. The men who used to tip their hats when she walked by now looked right through her. The town matchmaker, old Mrs. Peterson, had actually crossed the street to avoid talking to her last month. Even the widower with 6 children had turned down her father's suggestion of a match. 6 children and no wife, and he still didn't want her. Margaret heard footsteps on the stairs and turned away from the window. Her mother appeared in the doorway, already frowning. "Why aren't you downstairs? People are asking where you are." "No, they're not, Mother." Margaret kept her voice steady. "No one's asking about me." Her mother's face tightened. "Don't start with that attitude today. Your sister deserves to be happy without you casting shadows." The words stung like they always did, but Margaret had learned not to show it. She followed her mother downstairs and took her place at the edge of the celebration, where she belonged, where she always belonged now. She watched her sister dance. With her new husband, watched her other sisters laughing with their own husbands. Watched the young girls of the town flutter around eligible bachelors like butterflies. She used to be one of those girls. When had everything changed? The answer came that Sunday at dinner. The whole family gathered like they did every week. All her sisters with their husbands. All the attention on everyone but her. Her father cleared his throat in that way he did when he had something important to say. "Margaret, we need to discuss your situation." The table went quiet. Even the children stopped chattering. Margaret's hands went cold in her lap. "You'll be 33 in 6 months." Her father continued, not meeting her eyes. "I've been more than generous, allowing you to stay on with no prospects and no purpose. But I have a responsibility to your mother and to this family's reputation." Margaret's sister tried to interrupt. "Father, maybe this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time." He finally looked at Margaret, and his expression was harder than she'd ever seen it. "You have until your birthday to find a husband. Any husband. If you can't manage that, you'll need to make your own way. I won't support an unmarried daughter past that point." 6 months. He was giving her 6 months to find someone, anyone, or be thrown out with nothing. No money, no home, no options. What was a woman supposed to do with no means and no family support? The only jobs available were as a maid or a seamstress, and those barely paid enough to survive. Her mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, but Margaret noticed she didn't argue with her father. None of them did. Her sisters looked uncomfortable, but they had their own lives now, their own families. She was on her own. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what her father had said, about the cold reality of her situation. She was too old, too plain, too educated for the men in Willowbrook. They wanted young girls who would obey without question, who wouldn't challenge them or have thoughts of their own. But what choice did she have now? The next morning, she did something she never thought she'd do. She wrote an advertisement for the Matrimonial News, one of those papers where people looked for spouses in distant places. Her hands shook as she wrote it. Educated woman, good health, seeking marriage partner, capable household manager, quiet disposition, no family ties. She left out her age. She left out everything that might make someone say no before they even met her. Was it dishonest? Maybe. But she was desperate, and desperate people did desperate things. The responses came slowly. 3 letters in the first week. Her heart jumped when she saw them, but that hope died quickly. 2 men withdrew their interest the moment she told them her real age. The third never wrote back after her honest reply. More weeks passed. A few more letters came, but the pattern repeated itself. As soon as they knew the truth, they disappeared. One man actually wrote back to scold her for wasting his time. She burned that letter and watched the ashes scatter. Winter was coming to Montana, and with it, her birthday. Her father reminded her weekly how much time she had left. Her mother stopped speaking to her at all except when necessary. Her sisters visited less and less, uncomfortable with the situation and unsure how to help. Margaret started selling her things. Small items at first, things no one would notice. A brooch her grandmother had given her, some books she'd read a dozen times. She was saving every penny she could, knowing she might need it to survive on her own soon. She'd almost given up completely when Mrs. Peterson stopped her on the street one cold October morning. The old matchmaker looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot. "I heard about your father's ultimatum," she said quietly. "I'm sorry, dear. I truly am." Margaret just nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "There was a man in the general store yesterday," Mrs. Peterson continued. "Mountain man from up in the Bitterroots. Strange fellow, doesn't come to town often. He was asking about your advertisement." Margaret's heart stuttered. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you're 32, educated, and in need of a husband quickly." Mrs. Peterson paused. "He didn't seem to mind your age. Didn't seem to mind much of anything, really. Just said he needed someone practical who could handle isolation and hard work. What's his name? Calls himself Bear. Don't know if that's his real name or not. James McKenna, I think someone said. Lives alone up in the mountains, only comes down twice a year." Mrs. Peterson lowered her voice. "People say he's running from something. His whole family died years ago, or so the story goes. He's a bit rough, wild looking, but he's never caused trouble." Margaret's mind raced. A mountain man, someone who lived in complete isolation. It sounded terrifying, but then again, was it more terrifying than being thrown out onto the streets with no money and no options? Did he say what he wants? A wife before winter, someone who won't complain or run away from the hard life. Mrs. Peterson shook her head. "It wouldn't be easy, child. Mountain living is brutal, especially for someone raised like you were." "Where can I find him?" Mrs. Peterson looked surprised. "You're actually considering this?" "I don't have the luxury of not considering it." Margaret straightened her shoulders. "Where is he?" "Staying at the boarding house on Mill Street." "But Margaret, think carefully about this. There are other options." "Surely. Are there?" Margaret met the older woman's eyes. "What options do I have, Mrs. Peterson? Please tell me, because I can't see any." The matchmaker had no answer for that. That afternoon, Margaret walked to the boarding house. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She'd never done anything like this before, never approached a man directly. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and she was running out of time. She was running out of everything. The boarding house stood at the end of Mill Street, a weathered 2-story building that had seen better days. Margaret stood outside for a full 5 minutes trying to gather her courage. She'd never done anything so bold in her entire life. Ladies didn't approach strange men at boarding houses. But then again, ladies weren't supposed to be unmarried at 32 either. And here she was. She knocked on the door before she could change her mind. The landlady, Mrs. Cooper, answered with a curious look. When Margaret asked about the mountain man staying there, the woman's eyebrows shot up. Mr. McKenna? He's in the back room. But, miss, I don't know if... Please tell him Margaret Hayes is here to see him. About a business matter. Mrs. Cooper hesitated, then nodded and disappeared down the hall. Margaret waited in the small entryway, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. What was she doing? This was insane. He could be dangerous, or crazy, or... The man who appeared in the hallway stopped her thoughts completely. He was massive. At least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed too wide for the narrow hallway. His beard was thick and dark, streaked with gray, and his hair was long, tied back with a leather cord. His clothes were all buckskin and fur, nothing like what men wore in town. His hands were scarred and rough, the hands of someone who worked hard every single day. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were blue, startlingly blue, and they watched her with an intensity that made her want to step back. This was a man who'd lived through things she couldn't imagine. A man who knew survival in ways she never would. Miss Hayes. His voice was deep and rough like gravel. Mrs. Cooper said you wanted to see me. I heard you were asking about my advertisement, Margaret said. Surprised, her voice came out steady. About needing a wife. He studied her for a long moment, and she fought the urge to fidget under his gaze. Then he nodded toward the back of the house. We should talk properly. The parlor's empty. The small parlor was cold and sparse, but at least it offered privacy. Bear, if that was what he really called himself, sat in a chair that looked too small for him. Margaret took the seat across from him, keeping her back straight the way her mother had taught her. I'll be direct, he said, not wasting time on pleasantries. I need a wife before winter. I live 3 days into the Bitterroot Mountains, and once the snow comes, I'm trapped there until spring. I've been alone for 7 years now, and the silence... He paused, looking away for the first time. The silence is getting too loud. Margaret wasn't sure what to say to that, so she stayed quiet. I'm not looking for romance or love or any of that, he continued. I need a partner, someone who can handle hard work and isolation, someone who won't complain when things get difficult, because they always do in the mountains, someone who won't run when they realize what mountain life really means. What happened 7 years ago? Margaret asked quietly, his jaw tightened. Scarlet fever. Took my wife and daughter in the same week. I couldn't stay in civilization after that. Too many memories, too many people offering sympathy I didn't want, so I went to the mountains. I'm sorry for your loss, don't be sorry. Just be honest. Can you handle that kind of life? Because I won't come down from the mountain for you if you change your mind. If you agree to this, you're committing to it fully. Margaret thought about her father's ultimatum, about the cold way her family had treated her, about the town that had decided she was worthless. Then she thought about this man, this stranger who was at least being honest with her. No false promises, no pretty lies. What exactly would you expect from me? She asked. Running the household while I trap and hunt. Preserving food. Maintaining the cabin, basic survival skills. I'll teach you what you need to know, but you'll need to learn fast. Winter doesn't wait. He leaned forward slightly. In return, I'll provide for you, protect you, and treat you with respect. I won't lay a hand on you unless you want it. We'll have separate sleeping areas. This is a practical arrangement, nothing more. Can I ask why you chose to respond to my advertisement? For the first time, something that might have been a smile crossed his face. You were honest in your follow-up letter. Told the truth about your age when most would have kept lying. That matters in the mountains. Dishonesty can get you killed up there. Margaret took a deep breath. This was her chance, possibly her only chance. She had to know everything before she decided. I need to be honest with you too, then. My father gave me 6 months to find a husband, or he'll force me out with nothing. I have 3 months left. I'm too old for the men in this town, too educated, too plain. You're the first person who hasn't turned away when they learned my age. Bear nodded slowly. Age doesn't matter in the mountains. Only survival matters. Can you work hard without complaining? Yes. Can you handle being alone with just one other person for months at a time? I think loneliness with family is worse than isolation with honesty, Margaret said. So yes. He studied her again, and she met his gaze without flinching. Whatever he was looking for, she hoped he found it. I'm leaving in 3 days, he finally said. If you agree, you'll need to pack light. Only what you can carry yourself. The mountain doesn't care about sentiment or fancy things. Practical clothes, practical items only. I can do that. Once we leave town, there's no going back until spring. If you have doubts, you need to voice them now. Margaret thought about her father's cold ultimatum, her mother's disappointed silence, her sisters who had moved on with their lives and left her behind, the town that whispered about her like she was already dead. "I have no doubts," she said firmly. Bear stood, extending his hand. When she took it, his grip was firm but careful, like he was aware of his own strength. "Then we have an agreement, Miss Hayes. I'll come to your father's house tomorrow to make it official. He'll want to meet you." I assumed as much. Bear headed toward the door, then paused. "Fair warning. I'm not good with townfolk or their rules. I'll be respectful, but I won't pretend to be something I'm not." "I wouldn't expect you to." After he left, Margaret sat in the cold parlor for a long time, trying to process what she'd just agreed to. She was going to marry a complete stranger and disappear into the mountains for months at a time. It was crazy. It was reckless. It was her only choice. That night at dinner, she told her family about Bear's proposal. Her father looked like he'd swallowed something sour, but she could see the relief in his eyes. Her mother actually gasped. "A mountain man? Margaret, surely you can't be serious. What will people say?" "They'll say I'm married," Margaret replied calmly. "Isn't that what everyone wanted?" Her father cleared his throat. "He'll need to come here and make his intentions known properly. I won't have people saying I married my daughter off to some vagrant without due process. He's coming tomorrow." The next afternoon, Bear arrived at the Hayes mansion exactly when he said he would. The maid who answered the door actually stumbled backward when she saw him. Margaret heard the commotion from upstairs and hurried down before anyone could turn him away. He stood in the grand entryway looking completely out of place, his buckskin clothes and wild appearance a stark contrast to the polished floors and expensive furniture. But he held himself with quiet confidence, not intimidated by the wealth around him. Margaret's father appeared, his face already set in disapproval. Her mother followed, clutching her handkerchief. Even her sisters had shown up, curiosity getting the better of them. "Mr. McKenna, I presume," her father said coldly. "Mr. Hayes." Bear's voice was steady. "I've come to discuss marrying your daughter." "So I've heard. And what exactly do you have to offer a woman of Margaret's breeding? What's your profession? Your property holdings? Your prospects?" "I'm a trapper and hunter. I own 160 acres in the Bitterroots, legally claimed and registered. I have a solid cabin, good land, and 7 years of mountain survival. I won't make your daughter rich, but she'll never starve and she'll be treated with respect." Margaret's mother made a small, distressed sound. "Margaret has been raised in comfort. She's educated, refined. How could she possibly survive in such primitive conditions?" Bear turned to Margaret, addressing her directly instead of her parents. "That's for her to decide. I've been honest about what life will be like. If she thinks she can handle it, then she can handle it. I'm not interested in what her parents think she can or can't do." The room went silent. No one spoke to Margaret's father that way in his own house. Her father's face turned red. "Now see here, father." Margaret stepped forward, her voice clear. "I've already accepted Mr. McKenna's proposal. I came downstairs to inform you, not to ask your permission. I'm 32 years old and you've made it clear I'm no longer welcome here anyway." Her mother gasped again. Her sisters stared. But Margaret kept her eyes on Bear and she saw something flicker in his expression. Approval, maybe. Respect. Her father sputtered for a moment, caught between outrage and relief. Finally, the relief won. "Fine. If you've made your decision, then so be it. When is this wedding to take place?" "Tomorrow morning at the courthouse," Bear said. "Then we leave immediately. Winter's coming and we need to reach the cabin before the first heavy snows." And just like that, it was decided. Margaret Hayes would become Margaret McKenna in less than 24 hours, and then she'd disappear into the mountains with a man she barely knew. That night, Margaret packed her trunk. She left behind her fancy dresses, her jewelry, her expensive shoes. She kept her warmest clothes, her sturdiest boots, and her books. The books were probably impractical, but she couldn't leave them behind. They were the only things that had kept her company through the lonely years. Her mother came to her room late that night, tears in her eyes. "Are you sure about this?" "No," Margaret admitted. "But I'm sure I can't stay here. The wedding happened so fast it felt like a dream." Just her, Bear, a courthouse clerk, and 2 witnesses pulled in from the street. No family, no celebration, no white dress. Just papers signed and a brief exchange of vows. When it was over, Margaret was legally married to a man whose first name she'd only learned that morning, James McKenna. But everyone called him Bear, and she could see why. They left Willowbrook within an hour of the wedding. Margaret had said goodbye to her family the night before, such as it was. Her father had shaken her hand like she was a business associate. Her mother had cried but offered no real words of comfort. Her sisters had hugged her, but there was relief in their eyes too. She was no longer their problem, their embarrassment, their reminder of what could happen to unmarried women. Bear loaded her single trunk onto a pack horse without comment. She'd packed as light as she could, but standing next to his minimal supplies, her belongings still looked excessive. If he thought so, he didn't say anything. He just handed her the reins of a sturdy mare and swung himself onto his own horse. "Stay close," he said. "The path gets rough once we leave the main road." Margaret nodded, adjusting her seat. She was a decent rider, had been since childhood, but she had a feeling this journey would test every skill she thought she had. The first few hours weren't too bad. They followed the road north, passing farms and settlements. People stared as they rode by. The fine lady from town on horseback with the wild mountain man. She could practically hear the gossip spreading already. Let them talk. She'd never have to hear it again. When they left the road and headed into the foothills, everything changed. The path, if it could even be called that, was barely visible through the undergrowth. The horses picked their way carefully over rocks and fallen logs. The terrain grew steeper with each passing hour. Bear moved through it all with easy confidence, like he'd made this journey 100 times. He probably had. Margaret struggled to keep up, her legs already aching from the unfamiliar effort of climbing. But she didn't complain. She'd promised she wouldn't, and she meant to keep that promise. They stopped as the sun began to set. Bear found a small clearing near a stream and immediately started setting up camp with practiced efficiency. Margaret watched, trying to learn as he built a fire, unpacked supplies, and set up a simple shelter. "You can wash up in the stream if you want," he said, not looking at her. "Water's cold but clean. I'll get the fire going and prepare some food." Margaret made her way to the stream, her body protesting every step. When she knelt by the water and splashed her face, the cold was shocking but refreshing. She looked at her reflection in the dimming light. Who was this woman staring back at her? Just yesterday she'd been Margaret Hayes, the unwanted daughter. Now she was Margaret McKenna, married to a stranger and heading into the wilderness. When she returned to camp, Bear had coffee brewing and was frying salt pork in a pan over the fire. The smell made her stomach growl. She hadn't realized how hungry she was. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a log he'd positioned near the fire. "Food's almost ready." They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the night creatures beginning their evening songs. Margaret had never experienced silence like this. Even in her father's house at night, there were always sounds of servants, of town life, of civilization. Here there was just nature and the space between two people who barely knew each other. "You did well today," Bear said suddenly, startling her. "Better than I expected for the first day." "I'm exhausted," Margaret admitted. "My legs feel like they might fall off. They'll hurt worse tomorrow. Then they'll get stronger." He poured more coffee into her cup. "That's how it works in the mountains. Everything hurts until your body adapts." "How long did it take you to adapt?" "I grew up in these mountains. My father was a trapper, taught me everything from the time I could walk." He stared into the fire, his expression distant. "Left when I was 20, thought I wanted civilization. Married, had a daughter, worked in a lumber mill, played at being a town man for 7 years. He didn't continue, and Margaret didn't push. She understood some wounds were too deep to talk about easily. "What made you decide to come back?" "After they died, I couldn't breathe in town anymore. Everywhere I looked, there were memories. Our house, the church, the school where my daughter would have gone. People meant well with their sympathy, but it felt like drowning." He took a long drink of his coffee. "The mountain doesn't offer sympathy. It doesn't care about your pain. You survive or you don't. There's something freeing about that." Margaret thought about her own pain, different but just as real. The years of rejection, the constant reminders of her failure to meet expectations. Maybe the mountain would be freeing for her too. The second day was harder than the first. Margaret woke with muscles so sore she could barely move. Bear was already up, the fire relit, coffee ready. He handed her a cup without comment about how slowly she was moving. "We need to cover more ground today," he said. "Weather's changing. I can smell snow coming." Margaret looked at the sky. It seemed clear to her, but she'd learned not to question his knowledge. If he said snow was coming, it probably was. They rode for hours, the path growing steeper and more treacherous. Margaret's hands blistered from gripping the reins. Her back ached from the constant uphill climb, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. She'd promised not to complain, and she wouldn't. It was mid-afternoon when Bear suddenly stopped. He dismounted and walked back to her, his expression concerned. "You're limping. Show me your feet." "I'm fine," Margaret protested. "Show me." His voice was firm but not unkind. Reluctantly, she dismounted and pulled off her boots. The blisters had broken and her stockings were bloody. She'd been trying to ignore the pain, but now that she looked at the damage, she felt tears prick her eyes. Not from the pain, but from the fear that she was already failing. Bear knelt in front of her, examining her feet with surprising gentleness. His rough hands were careful as he touched the wounds. "Why didn't you say something?" "I promised not to complain." He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw something like respect in his eyes. There's a difference between complaining and reporting an injury. Blisters like this can get infected, make you unable to walk. Then we'd both be in trouble. He went to his pack and returned with soft leather and some kind of salve. He cleaned her feet, applied the medicine, and wrapped them carefully in the leather. "These are better than your town boots for this terrain. Should have checked your footwear before we left." He stood, looking almost embarrassed. "My fault. I'm not used to—" He trailed off. "Used to what?" "Taking care of someone else. Looking out for more than just myself." He packed up his supplies. "We'll camp early tonight, give your feet time to recover. Can't have you crippled when we reach the cabin. There's too much work to do." That evening, they stopped by a small lake. The view was breathtaking. Mountains rising on all sides, the water reflecting the sky like a mirror. Margaret sat by the shore after Bear had set up camp, watching the last light fade. He joined her after a while, sitting on a rock nearby. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said quietly. "I've never seen anything like it. Town folk don't know what they're missing, staying behind their walls." He picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water. "Out here, you remember what matters. Food, shelter, warmth. The rest is just noise. Is that why you stay?" "Partly. Also because I don't fit in town anymore. Maybe never did." He glanced at her. "You don't seem to fit there either." "I never did," Margaret admitted. "I just didn't realize it until they made it clear I wasn't wanted. Their loss." He stood and headed back to the fire. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's the hardest day. After that, we're home." Home. The word felt strange. She'd lived in her father's house for 32 years, but it had never felt like home. Could a cabin in the wilderness with a stranger feel more like home than that? She didn't know. But she was about to find out. The third day tested every bit of determination Margaret had. Her feet still hurt despite Bear's treatment. The path was barely a path anymore. Just steep rocky climbs that left her gasping for breath. The thin mountain air made everything harder. Bear was patient, stopping frequently to let her rest, though she could see he was used to a much faster pace. He never made her feel bad about slowing him down, just waited quietly until she was ready to continue. "Almost there," he said in the late afternoon, pointing ahead. "See that valley between those two peaks? That's where we're going." Margaret couldn't see any valley, just endless mountains, but she nodded and pushed on. And then, suddenly, they crested a ridge and she saw it. A valley opened up below them, sheltered by mountains on three sides with a clear stream running through it. Trees clustered thick around the edges, and in the center she could see a log cabin with smoke rising from the chimney. "Wait. Smoke? You left a fire burning?" she asked, confused. Bear smiled slightly. "No, I have a neighbor who checks on the place when I'm gone. Old trapper named Pete. He'd have seen us coming from his place higher up and lit the fire to welcome us." The cabin was larger than Margaret had expected. Solid logs, a stone chimney, real glass windows. Bear had built this to last. When they finally reached it and she slid off her horse, her legs nearly gave out. Bear caught her arm, steadying her. "Easy. You made it. 3 days in the mountains and you didn't quit. That's something to be proud of." The door opened and an old man with a long white beard stepped out, grinning. "Well, well. Bear finally brought home a wife. Thought I'd never see the day. Pete, this is Margaret." "Margaret, this is Pete. He lives about 2 miles north. Closest thing to a neighbor you'll find up here." Pete looked her over with bright, curious eyes. "You got backbone, girl. Most town folk don't make that climb without crying. Saw you coming up the ridge. You kept your head down and kept moving. That's good. Thank you, Margaret said. Not sure what else. Sorry to say, I'll leave you two to settle in. Pete headed for his own horse tied nearby. But Bear, you remember what I told you. Blizzard's coming. Week, maybe less. You got 7 days to finish your winter prep. After Pete left, Bear showed Margaret inside. The cabin was simple but well made. One main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, a table and chairs, a loft above for storage, and yes, as promised, a separate sleeping area curtained off in the corner. I'll sleep in the loft, Bear said. You take the bed. It's warmer down here near the fire anyway. Margaret looked around at what would be her home for the next several months. It was small, rustic, nothing like what she'd known. But it was clean and solid and honest, just like the man who'd built it. Thank you, she said quietly, for keeping your promises. Bear nodded, looking almost uncomfortable with her gratitude. We both kept our promises. Now comes the hard part, surviving winter together. Margaret woke before dawn the next morning, disoriented by the unfamiliar darkness and the complete silence. Then she remembered where she was, the mountain, the cabin, her new life. She could hear Bear moving around in the main room, the sound of the fire being stoked, the smell of coffee brewing. She dressed quickly in the practical clothes she'd brought, tied back her hair and stepped out from behind the curtain. Bear glanced at her, then nodded toward the table where he'd set out bread and dried meat. Eat fast, we have a lot to do today. What kind of work? Everything. Firewood to chop and stack, food to preserve, repairs to finish. Winter prep doesn't wait, and we lost 3 days on the trail. He poured her coffee. Pete was right about the blizzard. I can feel it coming. We have maybe 6 days if we're lucky. Margaret had never done physical labor before. She'd arranged flowers, played piano, managed servants. But chopping wood, preserving meat, she had no idea where to start. Bear seemed to sense her uncertainty. I'll teach you as we go. Pay attention, ask questions, and work hard. That's all I need. The first task was firewood. Bear took her to a clearing where he'd already felled several trees earlier in the fall. He showed her how to use the axe, how to split the logs properly, how to stack them so they'd dry and be easy to access even in deep snow. Margaret's first swing with the axe was pathetic. The blade barely bit into the wood. Bear watched without judgment, then adjusted her stance, showed her how to use the weight of the axe and the momentum of her swing. Don't try to muscle it, let the tool do the work. Use your whole body, not just your arms. She tried again. This time the axe sank deeper. Her hands stung from the impact, but the logs split. A small victory, but it felt enormous. They worked for hours. Margaret's arms burned, her back ached, sweat soaked through her clothes despite the cold air. But slowly, steadily, the pile of split wood grew. Bear worked beside her, his pace much faster, but never rushing her, always patient when she needed instruction. You're stronger than you think, he said when they finally stopped for a midday meal. Most people give up after an hour. You kept going. I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice. You chose not to quit. He handed her water. That matters. The afternoon brought different work. Bear showed her the smokehouse where meat was preserved, taught her how to check if it was curing properly. He took her to the root cellar, explaining how to store vegetables so they'd last all winter. He showed her the traps he used, how to set them, how to check them safely. Margaret's head spun with information. There was so much to learn, so much she'd never known existed. In town, food simply appeared on the table. Here, every meal required planning, effort, knowledge. Don't try to remember everything at once, Bear said, noticing her overwhelmed expression. You'll learn by doing. I'll be here to guide you. That evening, as they sat by the fire after another meal of simple food, Margaret looked at her hands. They were blistered and dirty, nothing like the soft, pale hands she'd had a week ago. These were hands that had worked, that had created something useful. Does it get easier? She asked. Your body gets stronger. The work doesn't change. Bear was carving something from a piece of wood, his hands moving with practiced skill. But you stop noticing the difficulty as much, it just becomes life. What are you making? He held it up. It was a wooden spoon, the handle carved with simple but beautiful patterns. Needed a new one. The old one cracked. You made that? Everything in this cabin I made. Had to. No store to buy from up here. He went back to carving. You'll learn to make things too. Fix things. Use what you have because there's nothing else. Margaret watched him work, fascinated by the way his rough hands could create something so detailed. There was more to this man than she'd first seen. More depth, more skill, more patience. The next few days blurred together in a constant cycle of work. Margaret learned to split more firewood, to preserve more food, to patch the roof where Bear pointed out weak spots. She learned to identify animal tracks in the soft earth, to read the sky for weather changes, to move quietly in the forest so as not to startle game. Her body ached constantly, but Bear had been right. It was getting stronger. She could swing the axe longer, carry heavier loads, work through the burning in her muscles. She was becoming someone different, someone capable. On the 5th day, she was working alone in the root cellar, organizing the supplies they'd been storing, when she heard Bear calling her urgently. She dropped what she was doing and ran outside. He was standing at the edge of the clearing looking up at the sky. Dark clouds were rolling in fast and the air had changed. It felt heavy, electric. Storm's coming early, he said grimly. We've got maybe 2 days instead of 6. We need to work faster. They worked until dark, then continued by lantern light, covering the woodpile, securing the animals, bringing in extra water before the stream froze. Margaret was so tired she could barely think, but she kept moving. Bear's urgency was contagious, and she understood now that this wasn't optional. Their survival depended on being ready. Finally, well after midnight, Bear called a halt. That's enough, we've done what we can. Get some sleep. Margaret collapsed onto her bed, fully clothed, too exhausted to even remove her boots. She heard Bear climbing to the loft, heard him settle in. Within minutes, she was asleep. She woke to a sound she'd never heard before. A howling, roaring sound that seemed to shake the cabin. She sat up, disoriented and afraid. Gray light filtered through the windows, but it was a strange light, dim and filtered. Bear was already down from the loft, checking the door and windows. Blizzard's here, he said calmly. Early, like I thought. We're snowed in now until it passes. Margaret went to a window and looked out. She couldn't see anything but white. The world had disappeared into a wall of snow and wind. For the first time since leaving Willowbrook, she felt true fear. How long will it last? Could be a day, could be 3. No way to know. Bear was stoking the fire, checking their supplies. But we're ready. Food, water, firewood. We'll be fine. The first day of the blizzard was the strangest day of Margaret's life. Trapped inside the cabin with nothing to do but wait, she found herself truly alone with Bear for the first time. No work to distract them, no tasks to focus on, just 2 people and a storm. They moved around each other carefully at first, awkward in the forced closeness. But gradually, as the hours passed, the tension eased. Bear showed her how to mend his clothes, a skill she actually had from her town life. He taught her a card game his father had taught him. They talked, hesitantly at first, then more freely. What did you do all day in town? Bear asked, genuinely curious. Before all this, nothing useful, Margaret admitted. I read books, played piano, arranged flowers, attended social functions where people pretended to like each other. It all seems so pointless now. Reading isn't pointless. What kind of books? Everything. Novels, poetry, history, philosophy. My father thought it was unseemly for a woman to read so much, but it was the only thing that made me feel alive. Bear was quiet for a moment. I never learned to read properly. My father thought it was unnecessary. Tried to teach myself a few times, but never got far. I could teach you, Margaret offered. If you wanted. He looked surprised, then thoughtful. Maybe. Long winter ahead. Might as well learn something. On the second day of the blizzard, Bear asked her to read aloud from one of her books. Margaret chose carefully, picking a collection of frontier stories she thought he might enjoy. She read for hours while he carved and mended and tended the fire, and she noticed he was listening intently to every word. "You read well," he said when she paused. "Your voice is pleasant to hear." It was such a simple compliment, but it warmed her more than the fire. In town, no one had cared about her voice or her reading. Here, in this tiny cabin in the middle of a blizzard, someone did. "Thank you," she said quietly. That evening, as they prepared a simple dinner together, Bear spoke more about his past. About his wife, who he'd loved deeply. About his daughter, who'd been only 5 when she died. About the guilt he still carried for not being able to save them. "Fever took them so fast," he said, his voice rough with old pain. "One day they were fine. 3 days later, they were gone. I couldn't do anything. Couldn't save them, couldn't help them, couldn't even say goodbye properly." Margaret listened without interrupting, understanding that he needed to say these things, to let them out. "Coming to the mountain was running away," he continued. "I know that. But I couldn't face another day in that house, another night in that empty bed. Up here, at least the emptiness made sense. At least I could fill it with work and survival." "And now?" Margaret asked gently. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. "Now I'm starting to remember what it's like to not be alone. And it's both good and terrifying." Margaret understood exactly what he meant. She was feeling the same thing. The blizzard lasted 3 days. When it finally passed, they emerged from the cabin into a world transformed. Snow lay deep and pristine across the valley, the sun glittering off it like diamonds. The silence was profound. "Beautiful," Margaret breathed, "and deadly." Bear added, "This is just the first storm. There'll be more. Bigger ones. We'll be trapped here until spring now." He said it like a warning, but Margaret didn't feel trapped. She felt for the first time in her life free. Free from judgment, from expectations, from the constant reminder of her failures. Here she was simply Margaret, a woman learning to survive, learning to be strong, learning to be herself. "I'm not afraid," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. Bear smiled, really smiled, and it transformed his rough face. "Good, because we're in this together now. Partners, like we agreed." But as they worked together to dig out from the storm, clearing paths and checking on the animals, Margaret realized their partnership was becoming something more, something neither of them had expected or planned for, something that scared her as much as the mountain ever could. Winter settled over the mountain valley like a heavy blanket, and Margaret discovered that being snowed in wasn't the prison she'd feared. Instead, it was a kind of freedom she'd never experienced. No social obligations, no judgmental stares, no reminders of everything she'd supposedly done wrong. Just the rhythm of survival and the quiet companionship of someone who'd never asked her to be anything other than herself. The days developed their own pattern. Morning chores, tending the fire and animals, preparing meals. Afternoons spent on maintenance work, repairing tools, processing food stores. Evenings by the firelight where Margaret had begun teaching Bear to read and he taught her the old songs his father had sung, the kind of mountain ballads she'd never heard in town parlors. Bear was a surprisingly quick student. He approached reading the way he approached everything else, with focus and determination. Within weeks he could sound out simple words, and his face would light up with satisfaction each time he managed a new sentence. "Never thought I'd be able to do this," he admitted one night, carefully reading through a paragraph she'd written out for him. "Always figured my brain wasn't made for it." "Your brain is fine," Margaret said firmly. "You just never had a patient teacher, or a reason to learn." He looked up from the page, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "It's different when someone believes you can do it." Those quiet words hit Margaret harder than she expected. How many years had she lived with people who didn't believe in her, who saw her as a failure, a burden, a disappointment? And here was this mountain man, this supposed savage, who saw her as capable and valuable. The winter storms came and went, each one trapping them inside for days at a time. But the cabin never felt small. They'd learned to move around each other comfortably, to read each other's moods, to know when to talk and when to leave each other in companionable silence. Pete visited once between storms, checking on them and bringing news from his own cabin. He sat by their fire, accepting coffee and nodding approvingly at the well-stocked supplies. "You two are doing well," he said, his eyes moving between them with knowing humor. "Better than well, seems like." Margaret felt her face warm, but Bear just smiled slightly. "She's a good partner. Stronger than she looks." "I can see that." Pete finished his coffee and stood. "Another big storm coming in 2 days. You two stay warm now." After he left, Bear was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. Margaret had learned to recognize this mood. He was thinking about something difficult. "What is it?" she finally asked. "I've been thinking about spring." Margaret's heart sank. Spring meant the snow would melt, the trails would open. Spring meant Bear would go back to town for supplies. Spring meant returning to the world that had rejected her. "What about spring?" "I usually make 2 trips to town each year. Spring for restocking, fall for selling furs and preparing for winter." He glanced at her. "But you don't have to go back if you don't want to." "You could stay here while I go?" The offer was kind, but Margaret realized she didn't want to hide. She'd spent too many years hiding in her father's house, making herself small to avoid criticism. The mountain had taught her something different. "No," she said firmly. "If you go, I go. I'm not afraid of that town anymore." Bear smiled, and it reached his eyes. "Good? Because I'd rather have you with me anyway." The weeks passed, and Margaret noticed the changes in herself. Her hands were rough and strong now, capable of splitting wood and skinning game. Her body was lean and muscled from constant work. Her face had color from the mountain air, and her eyes were clear. She looked in the small mirror one morning and barely recognized the woman staring back. But the biggest changes were the ones she couldn't see. She stood straighter now, spoke with more confidence, didn't apologize for existing. The mountain had stripped away everything false, everything she'd been taught to be, and left only who she really was. And who she really was, she discovered, was someone who could survive anything. It was late winter when something shifted between her and Bear. They were sitting by the fire after dinner, Margaret reading aloud from one of her books while Bear worked on fashioning a new axe handle. She finished the chapter and looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. "I was just thinking how different this winter has been from the last 7. He set down his work. "For 7 years I sat in this cabin alone, letting the silence eat at me, convinced I deserved the emptiness because I couldn't save my family." Margaret stayed quiet, sensing he needed to say this. "But having you here, it's made me remember something I'd forgotten. That being alive isn't the same as punishing yourself. That letting someone in doesn't betray the people you lost." He paused, his rough voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "You've given me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. Not just company, but hope." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. "You've given me something too. For the first time in my life, I feel like I matter, like I'm worth something beyond what others think I should be." Bear stood and crossed to where she sat. He held out his hand and she took it, letting him pull her to her feet. They stood close, closer than they'd been since the day they met, and Margaret's heart was pounding. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Bear said quietly. "This was supposed to be practical. A partnership, nothing more. I know. But somewhere between teaching you to chop wood and you teaching me to read, it became something else." He touched her face gently, his calloused thumb brushing her cheek. "If I'm wrong, tell me now. But I think you feel it too." "I do," Margaret whispered. "I've been trying not to, because it wasn't part of our agreement. But I can't help it." Bear leaned down and kissed her, gentle and careful, like she was something precious. Margaret had been kissed before by suitors who'd wanted her father's money or her family's status. But this was different. This was real. When they pulled apart, Bear was smiling, truly smiling. "Guess we need a new agreement." "What kind of agreement?" "The kind where I stop sleeping in the loft. The kind where this partnership becomes a real marriage. If you want that." Margaret thought about how far she'd come. From the unwanted daughter to a woman who could survive mountain winters. From someone who'd accepted a practical arrangement to someone who'd found real love in the most unexpected place. "Yes," she said, "I want that." Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow melting in patches, revealing the land beneath. As the trails cleared, Bear began preparing for the trip to town. Margaret packed carefully, choosing practical clothes but also the nicest dress she'd kept, wanting to show the town that she hadn't just survived but thrived. They rode down from the mountain on a bright April morning. The journey much easier now that Margaret knew the path and had months of mountain living making her strong. When they reached Willowbrook 3 days later, Margaret sat tall in her saddle, no longer the desperate woman who'd left. The town stared as they rode down the main street. Margaret could see the shock on faces, the whispered conversations starting immediately. The pale, refined lady they remembered was gone, replaced by a sun-bronzed woman with capable hands and confident eyes. Bear led them to the general store to stock up on supplies. Inside, several townswomen were shopping, and they all stopped to stare. Mrs. Henderson, the biggest gossip in town, stood by the fabric counter with her mouth actually hanging open. Margaret? Margaret Hayes? Is that really you? Margaret McKenna now, Margaret corrected calmly. Yes, Mrs. Henderson, it's me. Well, we all thought. That is, we weren't sure. The woman was actually flustered. We didn't know if you'd survive up there. You look so different. I'm stronger than I was, Margaret said simply. She moved through the store, selecting supplies with